Thank you. Great to see many familiar faces and some new faces. How y'all doing? Doing good? Somewhat unenviable slot between lunch and coffee. So Jim is smart to put me here because this is a little different. It's like, and now for something completely different. Not really a health scholar. Some of my work does, feed into health, but my hope is to inspire you to think about ways to collect data that are, interesting and maybe get at questions in ways that existing data strategies may not be able to get at quite as easily. So I did take the liberty to change the name of the talk from creative data collection modalities, which Jim gave it, to weird data. And the reason for that is, what could be more creative than something like, respondent-driven sampling, like Ashton's talk? I mean, this is absolutely creative, but also, as we saw from his great talk, it's tough and it can be expensive. And so the outline today is I want to give a very quick recap of just very quick, sort of more conventional network collection strategies, and then talk a little bit about creativity and why, from my standpoint, it should be connected with theory. Give some examples, caveat. I'm just kind of going to go really fast through some examples in projects that I've had the pleasure to work on. So in general, more conventional network strategies come from questionnaires or survey modules, and those are great, and if you can do that, do that. They tend to take a theoretical stance, though, on what ties are, what a network is. That is, if somebody says, I'm friends with somebody, then they're friends with somebody. So you're getting into somebody's head, and you're believing them. So there are observational techniques, and observational techniques tend to be more nominalist. You tend to say, if I see something happening in the world, then I, as the researcher observing that, say that a tie exists. So some of these just general techniques are reported social relations in questionnaires and surveys, friends, advice seeking. Maybe you can get people to talk about their enemies. We couldn't. Cognitive social structures, when people report on the relations between other people. So that's being very realist in a way, to believe that somebody can actually see the relationships that exist in their department or in their hospital or something like that. Position locators, where people can talk about their ties to certain types of people, certain occupational categories, maybe even certain people with certain names. How many Craigs do you know? How many Davids do you know? This is great for doing network scale-up methods and things like that. But again, boy, try to get to afford a network module like that and come and talk to me. Direct observation might be a little bit more surmountable for some people, especially when you're observing records that exist in organizations. So you may not know that Jim and I go to Dane's and have burgers every now and then, but you know that we're in the same department. So you might be able to infer that we have some kind of ties together. So you can look at flows of goods, affiliation networks, etc. Or you can directly observe interactions, people sitting at the same table at lunch, things like this, people exchanging items. So the big point about this is that when you're collecting data, you're already doing theory. You already have an understanding of what the world is out there and what the truth is that you're seeking to get. And how you go about gathering that data, you're already in that sort of Schrodinger's cat sort of way. You're forcing upon the world a certain reality that you believe is there. So that can be really good, and you could be right, or you might be missing something. So maybe you're taking a realist approach to collecting data and trusting that people know their networks and they know their relations, but this may be wrong, as we know by the work of someone like Peter Behrman, that you could ask people, like, who do you marry in this world? Like, do you marry people from this clan or this clan? And people say, oh, people might be able to articulate some sort of sense of things, but oftentimes they may not actually even get it right themselves. You might have to actually observe. So knowing something about the substance of a process is really important, and there's always trade-offs involved in getting your data. And of course, we'd all like to get perfect data. We'd all like to get as much data, as deep of data as we possibly can. So we don't have infinite time and resources, so we make strategic kinds of cutoffs in the data we get. No data is perfect, but some data is better for the goals that you're seeking. So that's where I think it's time to get maybe a little creative or weird. It's not a replacement for conventional approaches. If you have the capacity to do something more conventional, then do it, in my opinion. If that's going to work, people will understand what you're doing a little better. But, there are times when the conventional methods may not actually be able to capture some of the core theoretical, assertions that you are trying to evaluate or test or elaborate. And necessity is the mother of invention. So probably one of the reasons I have kind of made a career out of getting weird with data is I just haven't had a lot of money. If I had the huge grants, I might have done something different, but I had to be like, pretty strategic. I got my PhD in 2008. Not a good year. I had to live in the margins and, try to make things happen. My postdoc advisor, Dan McFarland, gave me a nickname, Sparrowhawk, like being a little feisty little raptor, getting in there and getting maybe the small game that the big birds weren't getting. So it's always good to give you an acronym to remember things by. So here's what I think. You've all gotten emails from Jim, right? He signs his emails PTS. I didn't know what that meant for the longest time, but then I realized at some point it's peaceful thoughts. Peaceful thoughts, wonderful. And so when I was thinking about this, I was like, here's a good acronym, right? Probe the scope conditions. That might be one real reason to get creative or weird. That you can collect data on networks that might be marginal to a theory, or you might even collect networks where you think the theory might not even apply on it, to try to see where the line is. Test the core assumptions of a theory. That is, really say to yourself, like, I can't test the entire thing, but there's this one thing that it doesn't seem like other people are really testing, and I'm going to go deeper into that one thing. I'm going to collect the little bit that might actually test that thing. And then I think the best, which is see the process in situ, in the world. Go out into the world, and try to find the places where you think that thing might be happening in some very clear way. So where would you expect to see it happening? And maybe you might even want to try to generate something with a kind of network intervention or a kind of experiment or something like that. So I'll talk about these and give you some examples from my work. Again, there are many others I'll talk about. But my own work has concentrated a lot on trying to think about the connections between social psychology and social networks, to try to understand what are the underlying sort of ways that people feel in their bodies or think about the world that lead them to form certain kinds of ties with people. And how do the ties that they then form shape their minds? How do our minds and our understandings of ourselves, are they shaped by those people that we interact with? So there are obviously exogenous factors that come in, and these are a lot of the kinds of competing explanations, or they're part of the explanation. We have, homophily, that people are just attracted to people that are similar to themselves, or they tend to interact fatefully more because of segregation with people whom they're more like, shared foci or propinquity. But there are also endogenous factors within networks. That is, that people have certain kinds of relationships with others that then make those new kinds of relationships or existing relationships feel right or feel wrong. And that's a very interesting source of emotion, to think that there's a structural basis to emotion. I think one of the more famous things was Jim and Peter Behrman and Catherine Stovall found this sort of unwritten rule of romantic leftovers shaping the romantic networks or the sexual relations networks in high schools in the ad health data. That is, that they found that this cycle, this structure in the network did not happen as much as would be predicted by a kind of random mixing model. And so why is that? Maybe it's because it's very awkward for Matt and Maya to get together because their exes are together. So you feel like that's oogie, right? So ooginess, a sense of ooginess is an endogenous way of driving networks. I've worked a lot on this theory called balance theory, which is also a type of a sense of things feeling right or wrong about why people would connect with each other. And it's a fundamental aspect of our psychology that the social psychologist Fritz Heider posited long ago. But the main core idea is that in our sort of neurological architecture, we are prone to making friends with friends. Like rule one is something we even say to each other. Friend of a friend is a friend. We can articulate that rule. The other rules, maybe we don't articulate so much, but maybe they feel weird when they're broken. A friend of an enemy is an enemy. So if you're friends with your enemy's friend, then that's weird. That doesn't feel right. So an enemy of a friend is an enemy, and the enemy of an enemy is a friend, which is a terrible way of doing foreign policy, but that seems to be the way we're going. And in this case, these are just rules that were posited by balance theory. They've been intuited. People look at networks and have looked at networks forever and said, oh, there's some sort of structural balance going on in there. So we could see something famous like the bank wiring room at the Hawthorne plant, which is one of the very early studies in networks. And they asked people who their friends were and who they had antagonisms toward. And there was a big to-do about opening the windows and not opening the windows. And so this whole group sort of degenerated into two opposing groups here that really had tension with each other. But is that in and of itself a test of balance theory? There are all sorts of other ways of decomposing networks into triadic structures. Some of these structures shouldn't happen if balance theory is right, and others should happen more often. You can decompose every network into n-choose 3 triads that fall into these 16 isomorphic classes, and then you can see, like, ooh, well, how many are falling into each of these? And you could say, well, look, if all of those 4 rules of balance are true, then the only 2 triads that are actually allowed are these 2 triads. They're the only ones that satisfy all 4 of those rules. And if that is true, then we are up a creek without a paddle, because the world will necessarily migrate toward being either everyone loves each other, and how likely is that, or toward being split into 2 and precisely 2 groups that hate each other, which seems to be all it takes for this to happen is one person's relationship to fall out of balance. Now, of course, the other rules of balance might not, we could relax certain models of balance, but we probably would never relax the first rule. A friend of a friend is a friend. If we keep that, then we have other possibilities out in the world, but we don't have limitless possibilities for what the micro-macro link will be. That somehow our own, if you want to call it a set of cognitive modules, if you want to call it some sort of evolved capacity, if you want to just think about it as something in our heads is driving us toward gravitating towards certain relationships and away from others. And what an amazing theory, right? I mean, fascinating, and enough to keep me busy. But one of the things I would say was I started to think about all of the various snapshots in sociology, which just looked at sort of literally black boxes, didn't go into people's heads, just looked at the structure and then would infer balance. This is more balanced. That must be balance is going on in this case. Or looking at psychology experiments where they would just bring people into a lab and have them read a vignette and then ask them to imagine how they feel. That doesn't seem quite right either. Or then more recently, a huge amount of interdisciplinary network science work that started to just get all kinds of network data from either just doing simulations or looking at things like online multiplayer games, looking at Wikipedia entries, looking at how people will, dunk on each other on Twitter or not, like all of these things, and then saying this is all a demonstration of balance theory. So my getting creative or getting weird was really about getting back to the main theory, which is people who are shaped by feelings that certain kinds of relationships are appropriate or not appropriate. So Pete, probe the scope conditions. So one of the first things that I did was I found a weird data set that somebody else collected a long time ago, but seemed very appropriate for the theory. And this was a data set of urban communes collected by Ben Zablocki, which looked at, well, it was more than 31, but there were most of them didn't last more than a year, okay? So it was the 70s, communes came, communes went. But in this case, looking at many different communes and thinking the scope conditions for balance theory must be that the group of people are faithfully engaged with each other. If I can just leave the group, then why would balance play out at all? I could just be like, this is weird, I'm out of here. And that's why I think a lot of the groups didn't survive. But the groups themselves varied a lot in terms of their degree to which people were committed to each other. So I've found this not perfect data, but Zablocki and company collected all of this interesting affect about loving, hating, finding people exciting, about a relationship in this. I did a latent class analysis to try to derive ties from this. Again, I wouldn't have done, if I had a lot of money, if I had a lot of time, a big lab, I wouldn't have had to do this. But I found that basically it did fall into positive and negative sentiments in these cults. Some of them were cults, and some were communes, and some were just kind of hippie crash pads. And so the hippie crash pads were just like had a very low commitment condition. People could just come and go, and they did. The more cult-like places had very strong sense of we, the group, and a sense of being engaged in something meaningful together. So I was probing the scope conditions of balance theory here, looking at those triadic structures in 31 separate networks, 31 separate small networks, looking at the number of triads that fell into each of these classes over time. And sure enough, what I found was that over time, in the high commitment communes, they would move toward greater balance. They moved toward triadic structures that met the 4 rules of balance, that they were actually shaping their social relations according to these rules. But I did not find that in the low commitment groups. In the low commitment groups, things only moved very marginally. All right, so paper AJS, happy to send it to you at some point with my great advisor, Noah Friedkin at UC Santa Barbara. All right, I also want to point out that there's another, one of the things we did also test in that paper was that there's an underlying sense of tension in a relationship. That's a core assumption of the theory that black boxes and simulations just can't get at. Are people really feeling tense toward each other when they are embedded in networks that are imbalanced? So I'll point out some other creative ways of doing this from weird data. Here's a very weird data set. This is a data set that will never exist again. It was a data set of probably, some of you remember this, people used to pass notes to each other in school before we texted and all of that. They would write down a note, and then it would even be passed down through, down the aisle to somebody, then they would respond to the note, and the note would come back. So passing notes. So this is from an archive of past notes and from a great paper published from it by my old advisor, Dan McFarland, and Tom. Tom, you still in here? Yeah, Tom. It's a great paper. So in the point in this in the paper is called Writing into Relationships. And so the point here is like Meg passes a note, and Meg says, do you know Stephen Johansson? A lot of people think he's a geek, I guess, but he likes me and he's so nice. We talk on the phone a lot, and I went over to his house last night. Nothing happened, but he's really nice, and his family is nice, and he has a huge house and a pool. Asshole joke. His sister's pretty. She looks 12 and a half. She doesn't look 12 and a half. She looks like she could be in 9th grade. A lot of people told me not to worry about what other people think. I asked him to twerp. The woman is required to pay dance, kind of. I still have to figure out what's happening. I don't know what we do or where we go with. You're probably thinking I'm crazy to go out with Stephen. I hope you don't think he's a big nerd, because I know he's not super popular or anything, but not a lot of people really know him. And once you get to know him, he's super nice. Anyway, better go. Laura passes a note back. I know Stephen pretty well. He's a great guy. I think it would be awesome if you two went to twerp. He is just shy, not a big nerd. Sarah, his sister, is really pretty. We play tennis together. So, what a great friend, Laura. Now, if you looked at this in structural balance terms, you would see that Meg is posing a bit of a quandary to Laura. She's actually writing a note that is presenting relations, and some of them that she's uncertain about because she feels that if Laura, her friend, does not share that same view, that there will be an imbalance. And Laura does a great job at cleaning it all up. Balanced. What a great friend. So that's a weird data set, but it tests a core theoretical assumption in the theory that hasn't been tested before. So going into the theory again guides you to weird or creative data sources. I'm currently working on a paper with an undergraduate here that is also with the communes data, and we found in the communes data a new thing that had never been used, which is that many of the commune members were asked to draw their family relations at the time that they left home, and to give it positive and negative ties between them. So mom and dad in this case like each other. Sandy likes dad, but I don't like Sandy. I'm having problems with Sandy. There's tension towards Sandy. So we basically turned each of these networks we turned each of these drawings into a network, and we found that people have very different forms of home life. Some of them are very balanced, and some of them are very imbalanced. And this also feeds back into some very interesting work by Matthew Bashirs, and Laura Bashirs, and Quintain, that where people were given networks that they had to remember, and in very general terms. And when they remembered them, they would oftentimes misremember them as being more balanced than they really were. So that's very strong evidence, again, that there's some tension, or, one might say at least some underlying weirdness to thinking about networks that are imbalanced, that there might be deflection in ACT terms, that some kind of underlying weirdness. And we're finding that the people who came from homes that were less balanced and live in communes that are less balanced are less tense. So there's some socialization to this. All right. So I think the majority of the interesting stuff comes when we really see a process. So instead of intuiting a process from network data, maybe you could go out in the world and try to generate the process yourself or see it in action. So something like hierarchy, for example. Here, Larry's creating very quickly a hierarchy through the double attack strategy. Mo thinks he's going to do it. Wow, nope, not going to happen. So, or is that Curly? Sorry, that's Curly, right? So hierarchies, where do they come from? They surround us in nature. We often examine hierarchies, but previous research, again, basically looks at these things in a very static way. So hierarchies can have very serious mental health consequences. If you've been tracking some of the bullying literature recently, it's quite depressing to see that things like AI fake nudes being passed around in schools are incredibly damaging. And one of the bizarre things, or maybe not bizarre, maybe it makes perfect sense from a structural standpoint, is that people will blame the victims of the AI fake nudes, even when they know they're fake. And there's a way in which that it still has a very destructive capacity on people, even though people understand that this is probably, that this thing is not this person, but the act and piling on and generating that must be driven by something. And it could be driven in part by how dominance hierarchies are formed, how humans as primates will engage in certain kinds of strategies in order to gain status and to move higher in these things. So I think we have Bob Ferris coming as well. And oh yeah, well there you are. Okay, you snuck in. Okay, yeah. So this is a wheelhouse that he is very much involved in and has done incredibly important work in. So trying to generate the process of this is, you don't want to go around and be like, hey, why don't you all bully each other, But, there are these sort of ways that you might predict or think about this in a triadic way, and think about the ideal types of hierarchy formation, and what animal is the most hierarchical? It's chickens, I think. I think chickens are the most hierarchical. They have very strict pecking orders, and so maybe a weird strategy this is an inspiration, is that there's a sociologist who has studied chickens and other animal behavior to try to see how hierarchies form, and to try to show and test whether or not hierarchies are generated by just sheer brute force or by some interactional dynamics, right? We tend to think of like, oh, well, in the pecking order of chickens, it must be the biggest, strongest chicken who's at the top of the pecking order. That's not true. They've measured the chickens. They've weighed the chickens. The most badass chicken is not the biggest chicken. It may be the chicken who's just maybe gotten in there early, and gotten more practice. So there are different triadic strategies like Larry, Moe, and Curly were engaging in. There's the double attack, where you go from an empty triad to one where there's an attack and then a quick another attack, right? And that was basically what Larry was doing, except actually in his case he had to reverse the attack on Curly. So you can actually watch processes as they unfold. That's the point here. You could watch it in the animal kingdom. You can actually see how these things unfold in real time in animals, as Ivan Chase did. In this case, there was a common path for creating hierarchy that went through these kinds of strategies. So, I'm interested in people, and I was long interested in trying to understand the rules of balance among people, and whether or not children, for example, understand the rules of balance. How much of these are things that we learn? How much of these are things that we have kind of just hardwired, that we develop? So I wasn't the only person who was interested in sort of how dominance or hierarchy might work with children. In the 80s, a social psychologist named Floyd Strayer had done some of this work by looking at kids in preschool classrooms, looking how they interacted with each other, looking at interaction sequences, and Strayer was kind of a comparative ethologist. So he was trying to think of like, well, how hierarchical are humans compared to other primates? So he videotaped 3 Canadian preschools. He looked at how the kids initiated interactions with each other, whether these were positive or whether these were conflictual, and then coded it. And then I tried, along with Dan McFarland, we tried to find these data, and unfortunately I don't think that these data exist anymore. but the findings were quite informative, that you could basically look at how these acts unfolded in these different preschools, and found some differences in the preschools. You had to code them very painfully about how, what is a physical attack, what's a threat gesture. We took this coding schema and used it later, but the results for Strayer were ultimately quite interesting. That kids were a little bit more in terms of their dominance hierarchies. They weren't like macaques, but they were pretty hierarchical, and they were pretty rigid in their hierarchies. And he also found, interestingly, in terms of balance theory, that a lot of these classrooms did kind of fall into two groups of kids who had a lot of positive relations within the groups, and they had a lot of conflict between the relations. So kind of prima facie evidence that even Canadians, right? Even Canadians are doing this. So fortunately, I did finally, when I got to Duke, I did find someone who had a lot of money and who had an R1, and we used some of that to install cameras in 2 different preschools and 7 different preschool classrooms. We decided we were going to basically redo what Strayer had done, and to test balance theory, but also to test the feasibility of this kind of weird technique of filming human beings and who can't really necessarily articulate. I mean, I've had this debate with some psychologists. Some say that 3-year-olds can tell you who their friends are, but when I was 3, I thought I was a butterfly, so I'm not sure. Maybe that was just me. So in this case, I think it would be interesting to see how much their own realist reports of their relations actually follow and are consistent with their observed nominalist interactions. And I think that sometimes we find the meaning of friend can be quite different, and sometimes boys say they're friends with people who they kind of beat up on. So we did stuff with naturalistic video data. As you will notice in this case, the kids are wearing masks. Unfortunately, our data collection coincided with a little thing called COVID-19, and so we didn't get to collect data for several months, and then when we finally did, the kids were masked. But here's a little clip. Watch this kid. Here's the kid with the teddy bear. Yeah, take that. All right. Now they're sort of circling around. What are you doing? The video goes on. It's quite interesting. These kids start to form like a little human chain where they're sort of going around and to the teddy bear attacker, as we call him, and start to egg him on. They all pile on. They basically form a school against the teddy bear attacker. And so we had 2 bass teams. Tom still thank you, was my RA for this, and it was an awful lot of work, but we had a great team of Duke undergraduates who went through with Noldis and coded second by second the interaction structure of these videos. These are free play times, 10 to 15 minute free play, and looked using the Strayer coding. We looked at conflict and cooperation behaviors in these classrooms. We looked at things that were self-initiated, other-initiated, mutually initiated, whether the behavior was physical, like giving somebody a pat, giving them a hug, or taking their toy, something like that. We then generated dynamic flowing networks from these, and you can see some stills from this in terms of the conflict and cooperation, or we turned it into a network movie using NDTV, so you can sort of see the unfolding in real time of how these behaviors come together, become positive. Reds are negative conflictual behaviors. Can start to see the kind of signature unfolding of conflict and cooperation during playtime. But more importantly, each one of these interactions in each second either conforms to a rule of balance or violates a rule of balance. If I've been nice to Lynn and we've been playing together very nicely, and then Lynn goes and starts to play nicely with Tom, and then I go punch Tom, that's not right. That violates the friend of a friend is a friend, right? So we have fed this into some other packages. You're going to learn, I think, on Friday a little bit more about relational event models from Carter Butts himself. So that will be useful to maybe think about this. We looked at relational event models and been modeling this second by second. What is the probability in this second that I'll be nice to Tom, given a certain decay function of my environment of relationships in the last 10, 15, 20, 30 seconds, or 5 minutes? And we're finding that the kids really are largely operating under the rules, at least the first rule and the first 2 or 3 rules of balance to a certain extent, is shaping their likelihood of their behaviors. So you can learn more about our methods in our shameless plug for our book, Network Analysis. In future directions, I'm trying to work with some people here in the AI initiative to try to think about how we can use the data sets that we did code as kind of training an AI to then look at the hundreds of other videos that we were not able to code manually to see if it's feasible to extract distances, and this is called sort of like a cartoonification or stick figurification of video, and you can use those kinds of data to maybe extract relations. How are we doing for time? Do I have until 2:30? Is that right? Yes, I think so. Yeah, I had an hour. Okay, thank you. So I'll give you a few more seeings. So remember, we've got probe, right? Probe the scope conditions, right? Test a core assumption of the theory. See something in C2, in the world. I'll give you a couple more examples of this, and we'll call it a day. A lot of times people think about how ties form, and they intuit a process from just the ties being there. It must be balance, or it must be homophily, or it must be propinquity, or shared foci, or maybe something. They take covariates, but they don't actually see the ties as they form. So I've spent a lot of my career trying to find environments where people don't have ties, and then we see them form. So I don't have time to talk about this today, but I'll plug it. Coming out AJS in fall, looking at, and I presented it at Columbia, some of you saw it, looking at networks at Duke Divinity School and looking at how they form. So like graduate programs are a great place to try to explore these tie formation processes and how much they're shaped by different factors. Another thing to do is to maybe give people an opportunity to form ties. So as part of a project where we were looking at romantic tie formation, or the initial probability of ties forming romantically. And so the way that we did this is we created a speed dating environment. Right? Speed dates kind of went out of fashion. Now they're coming back because everybody realizes that a lot of these things, online things, are not working out. So the core theory here, so this is also kind of testing a core assumption, is that some people really believe that people are attracted to people based on homophily alone, or based on pheromones, or something. That it's just like all you would have to do is like sniff each other, look at each other, get some basic information, and it's like we're a match. That's good. And that's kind of like the way some of the websites are. But our assumption as sociologists was, and as a former actor, is that performance matters. that being, like doing something, interaction matters. So we set up a speed date in the Saris building at Stanford where we literally had graduate students come in and participate in a speed date. 4 minutes, the men would move from, so these were heterosexual speed dates. Men would move from table to table. They have 4 minutes to have a conversation. If both people think that it was good, then we gave them contact information. And I do believe that there was one marriage that came out of this. I'm not sure it's still there. Let's see. We recorded the speed date, so you can see the people are wearing sashes, so the sash had a recorder on it, and back then, in the day, we did not have the great way of extracting, transcribing this, so we had to actually transcribe it by hand, but we did have prot scripts, which are ways of doing pitch modulation and other prosodic features. So it takes out the content of the speech and it just looks at the sound. So it's like, woo, huh? So it's at the level of this kind of sub rosa, just making noises. Is that important? Is it the content? So here's a little clip of a speed date. Let's listen to this. And you tell me, is the content of what's being said as important or the form?
What do you do?
All right. I tend to ask my students, how well is this speed date going? And it's really interesting. And then I break it down into, I teach this in a big intro class and a couple hundred students, and I can break it down and show, the men thought it was going better than the women did. So do it by major. It's it's not a terrible one, but they're taking turns, they're doing lots of interactional stuff. But really, I think it illustrates that there is something going on at the level of the performance. Goffman would say they were trying to find a footing together. They're trying to get into kind of they're trying to play music together, and they're trying to find a key that they can both play in. It's not really going that great. They're kind of laughing. They're kind of asking questions. So we did this actor-partner interaction model to see what are the things that the men are doing that just make them think that the date is going well, and what are the things that the women are actually doing that really make the date go well, and things like that. And we put all of that into a model, and we basically found that there was this really strong component of centering the interaction around the woman, moving into the higher pitched tone. So the woman says, "Yeah, I like to go camping," and the man goes, "Really?" Instead of the man going, "Well, I like to, deadlift," and the woman goes, "Really?" So the lower register not moving. So the whole thing is kind of like an opportunity for the woman to be featured, and we found lots of ways that there were things that the men did that were not effective, and there were things that the women that the men did that were effective, and having certain asking questions of the woman. Having her say more about herself matters as well. If the woman is taking a long turns, is talking loud and asking lots of questions of you, gentlemen, that is not going well. Hedging, going things like that. So, and anyway, this is about seeing the process as it unfolds. Some of these, as I said, they turned into real romantic relationships, and when trying to predict when both people thought the thing was going well. I'll mention another study where we've assumed a lot of things. As cultural sociologists, or really as a lot of social researchers, we tend to think that people share a lot of meanings in their head. They have a certain culture or a certain subculture, or a certain, let's say, reading of a book or a story or a certain interpretation of something in the world. It's like, well, men kind of think of it like this. Or, Southerners, they just have a different view of the Civil War. It's just different. It's in their blood somehow. And we wanted to test in many ways to what extent do shared meanings come out of interaction, out of coming together and forming groups and networks where I will attribute influence to other people in my group. So we did a study where we looked at, in this case, about 30 different book clubs, naturally occurring book clubs in the world, and we had them all read the same novel, Jarrettsville. And Jarrettsville would just come out. It's a novel about the South in the right after the Civil War. It's a strange book, and that's partly why I think it works well for this. Is it's like you can't quite tell exactly what Jarrettsville is trying to be. So my great colleague Clayton Childress and I published on this in AJS a few years ago, and we asked them their interpretations of the book, and in particular, the central action of the book, which is that Martha murders her fiancé, Nick, and then why did that happen? There's a lot of ambiguity around this, partner-on-partner violence, gender, there's race, there's a racial dynamic to this, so there's a lot going on in the book. And we asked people to also attribute to other people in the book club how much they listened to them. So a social influence process that was going on. But the upshot of this is that people's positions on the book were not deeply ingrained. In other words, when they came into the book club, we had them privately rate and talk about their interpretations of the book. And then we had them do it after the discussion, after drinking 2 bottles of wine, after having a long discussion and who they attributed meaning to. And then we found that after having these interactions, we started to see that, wow, women had a totally different interpretation of the book. Southerners had a different interpretation of the book. But it wasn't because that's something that was so deeply ingrained in themselves, but because they were interacting with other women and other Southerners, and they were also listening to women and listening to Southerners when it came to this book, which had a lot to do with gender and the South. So we could see that there were people who were connecting this to their own experiences. This woman says, do you remember a couple years ago a Fairfax County teacher? I remember this. I was teaching, so it was, probably, I don't know, she killed her husband. What? 3 months, not even. 3 weeks after giving birth. It's hard. Oh my God, really? I do remember. She got off, didn't she? I was going to say, she got off for postpartum depression. Yes, she sure did. I think Martha, had postpartum. There's nowhere in the book they talk about Martha having postpartum. Yeah. Martha had postpartum, and she just lost it. I think she was just sick of everybody treating her like crap and took matters into her own hands. I think she was just miserable, poor thing. Can we go home and make our husbands read this book? I think she really loved him, and in her mind, he never came to the marriage. Even though he did, she didn't know it. He was such an ass. He was such a dumbass at that point. He's so stupid about it. That was the dumbest moment in the whole book. We have all loved cowards. Let's be honest. We have all liked men who weren't the greatest. So they're connecting with the book around gender and putting themselves in it, and then they're resonating with others and saying, yes, that's what happened, and then they interpret the book. And here we find a very different thing about Southern honor. Southern honor. I know that things, we're saying they're different, from Jarrettsville now in the modern South. But even when I remember speaking to my mother-in-law about a topic of someone in the family getting divorced, she just looked at me like, we exactly don't discuss that. It's not just stuff from the movies that's made up. It's real. That part of the South depicted in Jarrettsville, it's real. My uncle married, and then he divorced, and then he married again, and she was Catholic, and so he couldn't tell anybody because her parents wouldn't have let her marry a man. So no one knows. No one knows. Even his now today children, that he was once married. That is my uncle. I went to Thanksgiving dinner. I was married when I was in my 20s, divorced, came home, lived with my parents. I went to Thanksgiving dinner, and one of my cousins asked where my husband was. And there was just silence at the table because I had been divorced for 6 months, but we didn't talk about it. So this Southern culture of silence is now being, used to explain why this happened. So there's a kind of a Southern reading that comes out of it. So all of this is to say, again, we can come up with balance out of relations with something like a book, that we can start to find a very female versus male reading of a book that is rooted in the same dynamics of balance that we found. So ultimately, though, having people read all this, we went even weirder. I went even weirder after this. I'll do you one more weird, which is getting people across this country in 30-something, just finding these book clubs, getting the book to them, getting them all to read the book, getting all of this, recording it all, right? And I've listened to 38 hours of people talking about that book. Is tough. So I had an idea. Let's get even weirder, and let's even have more of necessity be a virtue here, which is, what if we just gave people something very quickly that they could interpret? And what could be quicker than a smell, a fragrance? So I did an experiment with undergraduates where I brought them into groups of 3, and they smelled different fragrances, and then they interpreted what the fragrance was to them. And they, we have a very good sense of smell, we really do, but actually the meanings of fragrances are highly malleable, highly malleable. And so one of the things that we did was we had 3 fragrances. One of them was a very expensive perfume for women bought at Nordstrom. And the other was a very inexpensive cologne for men that I bought at CVS. And the third was a fragrance that my friend knew someone who happened to be a boutique perfume maker. And that was a fragrance that was specifically made to be strange, just weird. Like, she had made fragrances for a 3,000-year-old mummy. She has a fragrance museum. She's like, really, I sent her an email, and in 20 minutes she called me. She was like, I am on board with this project. So that was wonderful. So the point is that you give them something that has meanings that are encoded in the object very clearly. It's supposed to be like, this is an expensive woman's perfume, this is a rugged, manly fragrance, and this thing is just weird. And then put them together in multiple groups of 3 and ask them who they listened to, who they interacted with, bless you, in the group, who they felt influenced their decisions. We asked them all sorts of things about the fragrance itself, what it smelled like, who they thought the fragrance was aimed at, and then we asked them what they thought that would be called. Using Gestalt psychology, was it either Waluma or Taquete? Would it have a red triangle or a blue circle on the bottle? And we found these very, very clearly defined schemas that people brought to their fragrances. And then interacting with people, they started to very quickly coalesce on meanings around the fragrances. But the real strangest thing that we found was the fragrance that they were able to do this the best with was the weird fragrance. The weird one was the one that people were easily able to go, oh, that is definitely an expensive woman's perfume, right? And it's citrusy and it's floral, and people were like, yeah, for sure. And they really influenced themselves around that. So it shows you once again, I think, that something is coming from inside of ourselves that we're bringing out in those groups, just like in the book clubs. So getting out in the world and trying to see this process as it unfolds. So go back to theory. My theory is weird. I made a career out of being creative and the sparrowhawk going out and trying to find these things. If you can use existing data collection strategies to get at the kinds of core processes, if you're really interested in trying to estimate hard-to-read populations and other things, then what could be more creative than something like respondent-driven sampling and other modalities? But in many cases, we're missing a lot. We're leaving a lot of assumptions out there. So think PTS, probe the scope conditions, maybe think about multiple networks, maybe look at places where you might do a strategic comparison between 2 different populations, one where you would think that this thing would unfold more clearly, and another one where you would think it wouldn't unfold as clearly based upon the underlying theory. Test a core assumption. Create a little lure to go fishing and really see if you can catch something that hasn't been caught there. And then ultimately, there's all sorts of opportunities to go out into the world, to go into the wild, and to create an environment or find the environment where you think that these things can unfold in real time and pursue them. So thank you, and peaceful thoughts. Yeah, and I'll be here as well. I'm delighted to hang out with you all and answer questions or chat about your work. But yeah.
I guess I'm just curious how you conceptually position like the idea of the frenemy within balance theory.
The frenemy? That is such a great question. In balance theory, that doesn't really allow for frenemies. Yeah, I think that's an issue. That may be a weakness of the theory. So you're either a friend or an enemy. Ultimately, balance theory would say it goes one way or the other. You can have conflict and tension with your friends, but they're still your friends until they're not. So there are people who have done extensions of balance theory that are with valued networks, things like that. So Newcomb, had an extension of this, looking at it in a more valued way. So that could probably help with that. Yeah.
I'm familiar with, or have any thoughts on use of creative uses of data? I know you can scrape websites for partners and collaborators.
Yeah.
That's super unstandardized.
Yeah. Yeah. So yes, I am. I'm of the scraping generation. My advisor and I in 2003 were scraping the internet by hand and having undergraduates analyze data sets that way. So yeah, I think that if you can find an online source, maybe something like those notes, and I mean there are other things that I'm not as plugged into as I really should be, but I'm where you can use AI, you can use large language models to automate some of this, to extract this, and so as part of the Divinity School project, we have a huge amount of interview data, and one of the things that we've been doing is doing some extraction of sort of topics from the interviews and seeing if people start to talk about God in the same way over time, something that was suggested by Peter Behrman's group when I went up there and gave a talk a few months ago. So I think that there are lots of ways to do what very creatively here, and I would very much encourage it. I think you have to be careful that you are really doing it because it gets at some process or part of the theory rather than it's there, right? Yeah.
I'm just curious, how do you see the influence of cultural differences or political differences in balance theory? Unfortunately, you don't have data from a neighborhood in East Berlin in the 70s or something, but communitarian cultures or people living under very autocratic conditions, like a current federal agency where people are being asked to report on each other. Are these things that are affected just at the mark? Will people always be reduced to this behavior in your mind, but with a little tinkering at the edges, or would you expect to see variation?
Oh, I've been obsessed with that question. Thank you. So sure, some version of it. You articulated it really well. I've been doing a lot on polarization lately, actually, and the Divinity School study was kind of an exemplar of this because the United Methodist Church was schisming over same-sex marriages and also having openly gay clergy and things like that. And so that was one of the interesting things about that we found was that the more you were engaged in the peer influence of the group, the more you were central in that discussion network, the more your beliefs changed to become more liberal. And they have the same curriculum, they have the same thing. What's really driving it is engagement with others in the network. So I do not think that these things are inevitable. I think of them as kind of like, it's like an epigenetics, like it's our genes. We have the 4, rules of balance in our genes, but they're not expressed necessarily except under certain environments. And when you get someone who's in a position who says you're either with us or you're against us, that is the 4th rule of balance. And I do not think that there's a lot of evidence that comes naturally to us, but it does naturally. I mean, nature, nurture, right? It happens and is expressed in environments of perceived scarcity. And so the only place in the world where we really see it is in Highland, New Guinea, where there's like, that really is the friend, the enemy of an enemy is a friend there. And I would imagine in somewhere like, under extreme division in society, those things become triggered and exploited, frankly. Yeah, it's a great question. Okay, I'm around. I look forward to talking with you. Thank you. It's a pleasure.